Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox, the director, and I'm right now in the heart of Westminster in London, on what's known as College Green, on the morning of a historic win for the Labour Party in the UK's general election. I can see the Houses of Parliament, I can see the UK and international media, as well as members of the public, gathering to talk about the result, what it means, what comes next. And that was the focus of a special event we held earlier at Chatham House, away from the hustle and bustle here, where I was joined by an expert panel to talk about the impact of the nation's decision to elect a new government. Hello everyone, welcome, good morning, particularly if you've been up all night. This has been an extraordinary night in British politics, and we're here to discuss it at Chatham House. We're talking just as the last few seats are being called, and we can now say that the result was, as predicted, an emphatic win for Labour, which has a majority of in the order of 170 seats, and the Conservatives in power for 14 years now surely face a leadership contest that will focus on how to rebuild the party and something of a contest with reform as well, one of the stories of the night. So we're going to be talking about expert reaction to all this, but also what it means for Britain's place in the world and indeed its foreign policy. I've got a brilliant panel with me to talk about this. Author and journalist Will Hutton, president of the Academy of Social Sciences, regular contributor to The Observer, and author of the new book, This Time, No Mistakes, How to Remake Britain. Also with us is journalist Anne McElvoy, executive editor at Politico and host of Politico's Power Play podcast. And with us too is James Heappey, until very recently the Conservative MP for the Wells constituency. He didn't stand in this election, and until March he was Minister of State for the Armed Forces. And last but absolutely not least is my colleague Olivia O'Sullivan, the director of our UK in the World programme and co-author of our recent report on the big decisions in foreign policy for the next UK government, now confirmed to be Labour. So let us get straight into it. Will, may I start with you? Just a moment on this political shift. How big a moment is it, in your view?
Well, I think it's as big as 1945 or 1979 in Britain. I think that Labour winning more than 200 seats to come from opposition to government, it's a remarkable night in that respect. And it's accompanied by an extraordinary night for the Liberal Democrats, who've got 70 seats. So the character of the House of Commons is just be shy of 500 MPs who kind of repudiate the kinds of thinking which has driven the Conservative Party for kind of many decades.
Just on that, what do you think this is a repudiation of exactly? It's notoriously hard to answer that kind of question from looking at election results, but I'd love to know what you think this is rejecting.
I think the idea that markets are self-organizing to best outcomes, that the state you should try to shrink the state, that actually, I think, as John Curtis, the psephologist, was saying, that, we've one of the legacies of COVID is a big state. And I'm not sure that people were voting against, and people certainly weren't voting against that in this election. There's a willingness to kind of strike out in a different direction, to kind of use government more purposely than the Conservative Party has been doing, to take more care about British society and the quality of public services. But there's so many undercurrents. There are 4 Greens are back in the House of Commons. That's the first for the Green Party without that agenda. Of course, there's reform, where it has 4 seats with a kind of Britain, exposed to the same forces of the populist right as mainland Europe and the United States. So those currents are here in the UK. I was also struck, though, by the scale of tactical voting. That's where you vote not for your preferred candidate, but for the candidate most likely to win the constituency. And that's happening. That's been happening in Britain some time, but never on a scale that we saw last night. Some of the Lib Dem successes were extraordinary. And I think on the right, and James, I know will speak to this, but I think there's huge question marks about how can mainstream centre-right politicians like him make common cause with the Faragists? Could a Farage-influenced Conservative Party take back seats the Liberal Democrats have won, challenge Labour in London, for example?
Well, thanks. Let me just stop you there, and let's not try and guess what James Heappey might say, but in fact, ask him. James, what did you make of the night's results, and particularly of what Reform has managed to do?
Yeah, thanks, Bronwen, and good morning, everyone. I look first and foremost, the result of the election yesterday is a complete rejection of my party and its performance in government over the last 14 years. And I think there's no, it would sound ridiculous to try and sort of say it was anything but that. But there are, beyond that most obvious of headlines, there are a couple of other things that I think Chatham House viewers would want to also have in mind. This is in a first past the post system where normally even a majority of the side that Boris Johnson won would have been thought of as maybe a sort of two-parliament programme for Labour to overturn. They've overturned it in a single parliament, and not only just, they've overturned it in a single parliament from 85 behind to 170 ahead in 5 years. And actually, the collapse in my party's popularity isn't just a 5-year project. There was a time around the point at which the vaccines were being most successfully delivered when my party was over 50% in the polls and 30% ahead of Labour. So actually, in 2.5 years, we've gone from a position where an election called at that point would have delivered more Conservative MPs and an even bigger majority, one where 170 behind. The so what is if that can happen in 5 years going one way, it can fairly easily happen in 5 years going the other. And that's my final point. The Labour Party have been returned with this enormous majority, probably with a vote share that is in the mid to high 30s. Keir Starmer will enter Downing Street with a personal approval rating way behind that of Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, John Major, and with a parliamentary party who are very bruised by what's been going on in their constituencies. People like Jess Phillips, Wes Streeting have won only very narrowly because of the Gaza protest vote. And 2 Labour Shadow Secretaries of State have lost their seats overnight in John Ashworth and Thangham Debonair in Bristol Central.
I'll come on in a moment to what this means, particularly Gaza means for Labour, but just on the reform question, does it not look as if the vote on the right is now profoundly split between those leaning towards reform and those perhaps more moderates in the Conservative Party? And isn't this a problem for the Conservatives as they look to rebuild themselves?
Well, yes, obviously. And I for one would argue, but this betrays where I sit on the political spectrum. I think reform has now established itself a patch of political turf out on the right of the mainstream political spectrum. Reform are not hard right, but they're out there on the right of the political spectrum. I don't think that my party should whiz off to the right to try and wrestle with them for that populist position. I think that between the right-hand edge of the Liberal Democrats and the left-hand edge of reform, there is an awful lot of political space for a Conservative Party. And a Conservative Party that knows what it's thinking about is more coherent rather than constantly trying to trade off between the One Nationers and the Common Sense group, which is the kind of reform type people.
But that is clearly a conversation that may take the party some time. May I ask you one particular thing, which is what you would like to see on defence spending from the new government? It is the NATO summit next week. And while Labour has pledged to 2.5%, as the Conservative government did, it hasn't said when.
Yeah, I would be amazed. In fact, I have it on pretty good authority from people in the MOD that literally nobody expects Keir Starmer to arrive in Washington next week and re-announce the 2.5% that we committed to. So that is a great shame. And it removes an opportunity for real UK leadership and actually a really big statement ahead of the Republican National Convention, where a leading European ally making that commitment to 2.5%, with others maybe following, would have been a good moment to influence US politics. That now won't happen.
Won't happen because of concerns about money.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a big moment if the UK does not stand behind that 2.5%. Big moment for Ukraine.
I can't square where an immediate increase or where even to match the spending profile on the 2.5% that we have, I can't see where that money comes from, given all of the other spending commitments that that Labour have made. But in fairness to Labour, they have assiduously made their way through the campaign, not matching that commitment. So there's no sort of duplicity in this, but it is simply the case that they, as they have every right to do as a newly elected government, will go to the summit and honour what they said in the campaign, which is that it's an ambition when the fiscal conditions allow. But I suspect that Rachel Reeves' priorities are elsewhere other than the MOD in the immediate future.
Which would be bad news for Ukraine. And you wrote this week that Keir Starmer and the likely Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, who has been the shadow Foreign Secretary, can't fudge key issues like Gaza now that the election campaign is over. What is needed now on that front? And what do you think the other key decisions are going to be for them?
I think the Gaza question is a really good place to start, because we've tended, even so far on this call, to see it as a party management issue for Keir Starmer, and there've been a couple of bad results with that in the background. But in a way, I wanted to change the prism about that, because that's thinking about Keir Starmer and Labour as the opposition, which has to manage, and it's particularly so on the left of centre, but all parties have strains around foreign policy and wings and preferences. I think in this case, the big risk for Keir Starmer is that he's seen as an unreliable ally. And that's certainly a situation which he came close to getting himself into quite a lot of trouble on this by putting in, if you read the Labour manifesto, on the plan for recognition of a Palestinian state. Now, this is clearly an aspiration for both of the parties, but how you say it, the terms in which you say it, and how that lands with allies is very important. And it was, I think, quite loosely, in a way, quite badly phrased in the manifesto to try to tamp down this revolt in some of the ranks over Gaza and the vulnerability in the seats. It landed very badly with the Biden administration in Washington. And we're not even talking here about what would happen if Donald Trump comes to power. I think it would land even worse with him and the foreign policy priorities that he or his team might embrace. So I say this not to particularly to strike a pose on Gaza and Israel, but just to say there is an example where you say one thing because you just want to get across the line, or David Lammy talking about the International Criminal Court and basically signaling that he thought, yes, that would be acceptable for the Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu to be served an arrest warrant. Again, that went down so badly with allies that, as the US Ambassador Jane Hartley pointed out in an interview I did with her, that's not Keir Starmer's position. She said, well, if Keir Starmer and David Lammy, as the incoming Foreign Secretary, already have discernible differences, I do think that is going to go through wider foreign policy. On Ukraine, I think there is there is a solidity there. I don't see that being the biggest issue, but I think James Heappey is absolutely right. We have not heard the defence spending commitment. And again, not only because of the way it lands in Kyiv and what it means in terms of our position on Russia and Ukraine, but if we don't start to make those commitments, there's going to be trouble.
And I wonder if it, though, is perhaps slightly more significant than that, because France and Germany are wavering for their different political reasons in their commitment to supporting Ukraine. And we have US politics, put it mildly, in a kind of flux at the moment. And Joe Biden having just got the support for Ukraine through Congress, and now, of course, facing travails of his own. So it really could be quite damaging for Ukraine and for what that represents if the UK does not stand behind it.
Well, yeah, except that really, in terms of money for weapons, to be, bring it down to the basics. I mean, as long as politically the Starmer government stands behind Ukraine and doesn't start to wobble on that. But I don't see that as an immediate danger. Remember John Healey coming in as the defence secretary. Everyone's got to be crowned, but I think we can make some assumptions. He's very, very solid on that position, very trusted. It's in a sense quite conventional Labour right-winger on defence. So I'm not seeing the kind of wobble there that you referenced, Bronwen, and rightly in France and Germany. But Germany is ponying up a lot of money and the UK is ponying up rather less money. So if you're Ukrainian, in some ways you can cope with people you'd like, obviously much more forward support, but your allies, some of them are going to bring the money and some are going to bring the fervent support. And I think the question for the UK is what do we bring beyond the support that we brought in the early period of the war? And I do agree with you that is a question. I think if they can't really make the defense spending commitment work, the pressure is going to come from Washington. I don't think it's Ukraine that seems to me to be the biggest problem here. It's that we will, and I come back to my, I suppose, thesis A. The first McElvoy thesis of the New Dawn is that there is going to be pressure on this government, including from Democrats in Washington, to kind of shape up and say, are you still facing us, or are you really kind of in a bit of a wobble where we don't know whether you want to align with Europeans, for instance, on China, where there's absolutely a difference of approach between the EU and the administration in Washington? These are questions. Keir Starmer doesn't have to answer them tomorrow, but that's three already where I think people are very unsure where Labour stands. And in foreign policy, as you know, things can flare up from being at the margins of the national debate to suddenly being the question, what are you really for?
Absolutely. So, Olivia, what about Europe? There's been something of a Europe-shaped hole in this whole campaign, with neither main party really wanting to mention it at all. But now it gets real. Keir Starmer's talked about getting closer to Europe. What could that mean?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's probably two things I would pick up on Europe. One is trade and the other is security. On trade, Labour have made some sort of quite vague pronouncements about, well, firstly, they've been pretty clear that they want a veterinary agreement. They want to get closer to the EU on food and animal products and probably align with EU regulations. But they've also hinted that maybe some other economic sectors like chemicals, they'll try to do the same thing. Reducing some barriers in those areas might be a source of some of the economic growth the UK obviously badly needs, but it sort of opens up questions about what's the future direction here. Will a Labour-led government seek closer alignment with the EU on trade? And will the EU start to ask questions about whether that's sort of cherry picking or whether that's leading to reopening questions that, clearly a lot of the UK public are pretty bored of and sick of hearing about the first go round. That's actually, I think, going to be a big challenge, and the European Commission not that keen to reopen some of these questions about trade.
Olivia, let me just mention that there's a very good question come in from Christina de Corsi saying that Keir Starmer's ruled out rejoining the EU, that there is quite an issue with the impediments to pharmaceutical trade, and it costs ordinary British people a lot extra. And she's musing on whether Labour can handle this. The UK pharma industry is worth an awful lot of money, but has difficulty now selling to the EU.
Well, I think that brings up exactly the sort of theme I'm saying, is that if Labour seek to align or get closer in particular economic sectors, firstly, they've got a big majority, which means they'll have a big flank of MPs who are keen to get closer to the EU, who've been quite quiet so far. But they'll also have a lot of other economic sectors lobbying them to maybe do the same for them or get closer to the EU on specific things. It's going to be quite complicated for them to pick through that. And the European Commission are not going to be that keen to reopen lots of these conversations about trade. I think the second big issue is security, as everybody's picked up on. Labour have said they want a UK-EU security pact. They've not been that clear about the content of that. It could be something lighter, like more regular consultation on defence and security. But as everyone has been saying, Trump looms. If he wins in November, it may really force the issue of how can the UK work with Europe to fill a gap or counterbalance a US much more inclined to focus on Indo-Pacific security, to focus on China, particularly when it comes to quite nuts and bolts things like defence industrial production and procurement to keep providing aid to Ukraine. If that's reduced or withdrawn from a US that wants Europe to do more and pull its weight, then that's going to kind of force the question of how we work with European allies bilaterally and with the EU on those issues. So Labour have hinted at a security pact, but the details of that are going to get quite real, especially if Trump wins in November.
We'll absolutely come in on this. And I wanted to ask you, Keir Starmer said he doesn't expect the UK to rejoin the EU in his lifetime. That was a recent comment from the campaign trail. Are you expecting any kind of change now?
I think it'll start almost immediately. I think tonally, I think the language from the Keir Starmer, David Lammy, and actually the what will be the cabinet will be very much more about looking for ways to build a closer association with the EU, whether a kind of win-wins on both sides. It'll start cautiously. There's no doubt about the direction of travel. I think on the Defence Pact, I mean, their ambitions are, I know them well, their ambitions are much more than something light. And rather than kind of the EU kind of want to keep Britain at bay, and I think events in France and Germany will make mainstream European politicians and political and economic establishment kind of quite keen on doing something more purposeful and with more meaning. Defense Pact could extend to cybersecurity, data security. It could include energy and food resilience. And to make that work, of course, you have to have alignment or quasi-alignment with market regulations in those areas.
And this is in pursuit of economic growth, is it? Which has been a big theme of the Labour campaign. Even if people don't want to mention Europe, the source of growth for the UK is sitting there in its largest trading partner.
It's in pursuit of both economic growth and actually, wanting to be friendly and work with and form and create working relationships with, the European Union. I also think to speak up on foreign policy more generally. I think the vote here is not dissimilar to the kind of what a lot of electorates feel kind of across the West, that actually, as Joe Biden has himself said, that actually the Israeli response has been over the top. I'm watching with interest, the military establishment in Israel wanting a ceasefire and to get the hostages out. I think some of the things that were being expressed by the British electorate are also kind of, there kind of in debates in Israel, for God's sake. And I'm not sure that that leaning into that is going to be as kind of problematic as one of their speakers have suggested.
Yes, though I've been surprised that they have been so quick on the campaign trail to rule out things, musings on freedom of movement for young people and some of the schemes.
I would expect. What they're anxious about there is that, and the Tory government are anxious about this too. That the asymmetry in it, that actually there's more than 400 million Europeans and only 70 million of us. But I would be astonished if in 12 months' time there isn't some very workable Erasmus type program actually for young people. That's
right. So let's, and forgive me, we've got just a bare 5 minutes left. James, what happens to the European debate on the Conservative, on the right side of all this?
I think on the right, it will stay exactly where it is. I think that you'll have reform types who will want utter Brexit purity and a Conservative Party that'll be broadly where it's been. I just want to pick up on the previous conversation, because I think there are some really interesting things. I think what Nigel Farage said in his acceptance speech today about we're coming after Labour next, those red wall seats that Labour have just won back with greatly reduced majorities and huge reform votes, that will focus the minds of those Labour MPs about straying too close back towards the EU, because reform will go after Labour in the red wall, just as they've gone after the Tories. I also think, although the SNP are now greatly reduced in the Commons, there will be an amendment to the King's speech around immediately recognising a Palestinian state. There's no doubt that somebody will try that in order to cause Labour huge pain in their first week in the office. And so I just, there won't be much of a honeymoon period. And there are some foreign affairs issues that will immediately test Keir's mettle and that of his whip's office and that of all of these hundreds of new MPs on an issue that all the way through the campaign, they've seen caused them enormous challenge in their constituencies.
I think it's a very interesting prediction. Olivia, I've got a question here from Salah Kamil Salah. How different will the new Labour government be towards Africa, apart from cancelling the Rwanda scheme? And that obviously takes us into the question of how it is going to handle immigration.
I'll try to answer that briefly, given the time, but they haven't said a lot about this, but one of the areas where we can see a potential shift from the previous government is on things like development and climate. We all know they're being very cautious fiscally. They're not saying they're going to increase the aid budget until fiscal circumstances allow. But advisors around Lamy have clearly been thinking about the geopolitics of the energy transition. They've talked about forming what they're calling a clean power alliance. They want to work with countries, particularly in Africa, but around the world, that produce critical minerals that are important for green technology supply chains. They want to think about the geopolitics of that as well, because as we all know, China dominates the production of a lot of that type of tech, electric vehicles and solar panels, but the materials needed for them come from a lot of developing countries. So I think Labour see an opening there to rethink development. They've been keen throughout this campaign, Lamy and Lisa Nandy, to take a new approach to development. On the other hand, it doesn't look like it's going to shift too far away from the development white paper that the previous government published just this past year. So a big focus on climate, a big focus on development, probably a big focus on reforming international financial institutions rather than the UK itself increasing its aid budget immediately. The UK trying to be a bit of an activist shareholder in the international system, getting more money out the door for poorer countries. Rachel Reeves, in fact, may well be at the G20 finance ministers meeting later this month. It might well be her first big international engagement. And a lot of that will be about climate and finance for poorer countries as well. So that's not Africa specifically, forgive me, but that tells you a little bit about what their approach might be to some countries on the continent.
Oh, absolutely. They're not about immigration. And what do you think they will do with immigration?
I think they'll have to be very careful about it, because I think what's happened really in this campaign is very obvious. That I think the failure to stop the votes, that famous phrase that Rishi Sunak hoped would be able to kind of hold his difficult coalition together on what to do about irregular immigration into the UK. I'm very unconvinced by the Labour alternatives. I think the more I hear incoming governments talk about tackling problems upstream Interpol, the more I think that's going to be very, very difficult indeed to deliver on it. It's certainly true. I think the Rwanda policy was doomed in many ways on practical, on legal hurdles. They're not going to go that way, but I would, again, be quite surprised if they are not, like a number of other European governments of the democratic stripe, are looking at trying to find solutions that get some initial processing for those coming in towards the UK. If you cannot do that deal with France in the short term, and I don't think you can, then it does become enticing to look into, if not Rwanda, then Rwanda-style arrangements. But again, without this kind of complete over-complexity that was involved in this one, which I think was largely symbolic anyway. But I do think it is a weak flank for Keir Starmer. A lot of his party and the elites are still very pro-immigration, and a lot of those who've given their vote to Labour on this trust basis that we've seen today are much more sceptical about it. That's going to be a tension.
It is one of the contradictions of this election, if you like, that the Labour majority has been predicted for a very long time, and yet there remains an enormous amount of uncertainty about what might now follow, which is something that we are covering extensively at Chatham House, and Olivia and I have been writing about overnight. But with that, we are going to have to stop. This is a very short and sharp take on the election the morning after. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. More to come. Huge thanks to my panellists, Will Hutton, James Heappey and McElvoy, Olivia O'Sullivan. And do follow them all on X, on Twitter, and for all of our election writing and videos and more to come, do visit chathamhouse.org. See you next week.